I have to say I do feel a bit like an extinct species at the moment, having got up at 5:30 this morning and gone back to midwinter in southern Scotland. Okay, I guess it seems an odd thing to call Homo sapiens an endangered species, but many people, certainly in the 60s and to some extent today, certainly believe that he is, that we are. And it's very easy to find images like this on the web, where we have humans going extinct and being endangered and that kind of stuff. It's a dystopian idea, which of course is a very old one, but it got new life really in the 1960s when Paul Ehrlich, who was a colleague, or I was a colleague of his, I should say, wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And Paul, who was a great expert on butterflies and knew a lot of good biology, was absolutely convinced that the human race would collapse in numbers by the year 2000. In fact, the book was written in the late 60s, and he was certain that the human population would collapse to about 1 million or so starving people in the year 2000. Now, given the way we're going at the moment, that may well happen by the year 2017, but it hasn't happened yet. Okay. I asked Paul Ehrlich, after this book had been an enormous bestseller, it literally sold millions, I asked him, rudely, what had he done with the money? And he said, "Oh, I bought a private jet with it." And I thought, there speaks a true ecologist. Okay. So that's the background, the feeling that actually we're a species that's endangering ourselves, and of course not just ourselves, but many other creatures too, by our rash behaviour, such as flying back and forth from Edinburgh to London and London to Glasgow in one day. And there may well be some truth in that. We certainly are teetering on extraordinary numbers. And if you look at the patterns of population growth in the world, you will see that, in some senses at least, Paul had some things useful to say. It took about, from the origin of farming 10,000 years ago, it took 8,000 years to put on 170 million people. Okay, then from the 1930s, in 1850 there were 1 billion people on Earth. In 1930 there were 2 billion people on Earth. Then by 1960 there were 3 billion people on Earth, and that extra billion took 30 years. By 1975, there were 4 billion, and that extra billion took 15 years. By 1987, there were 5 billion, and that took 12 years. 1999, 6 billion, another 12 years. And 2011, 7 billion, another 12 years. So not only is the population growing, but the rate of growth seems to be extending as well. And it's clear that it's going to continue. It's not just simply clear that it's going to continue. You can see why it's going to continue. Most of the world has undergone what we call the demographic transition. The shift from high birth rates and high death rates, which characterized humans from farming until almost today, to the patterns of low birth rates and low death rates that we see today. And that's happened very quickly, much more quickly than Paul Ehrlich or anybody else expected. It happened in China very quickly, partly, of course, through the one-child policy, but whatever the merits of that, at least it worked. It happened by choice, really, in India very quickly, but the one place it hasn't happened is in Africa. And in Africa, the patterns of fertility are still fairly extraordinary. In sub-Saharan Africa and plenty of places, the mean family size is... Where are we? The mean family size is 6 or 7. And death rates have dropped, but birth rates haven't. And this has been going on for some time, which means that Africa is not only the center of world births now, but is also the center of world births to come, because Africa is also the center of young people. This is the only place in the world, more or less, where the median age, that's the age of the person halfway along the census, is under 25. And over most of Africa that's true, and many of those under 25-year-olds are 13, 14, 15, and will soon have children of their own. So it's not surprising then that the population is set to grow to at least 9 billion, and in fact the nature of the population will change, because the WHO has estimated the patterns of change across the globe, and what the one place that's rocketing up is Africa. You can see at the bottom there, it's rocketing up. But the world itself will, largely under the impetus of African growth, will peak at about 9 billion, or possibly now they think even a little bit more. So that clearly is something which we may need to be concerned about. And it's not only just us who needs to be concerned about it, because there are plenty of other creatures who are paying the price. Here's the patterns of population growth in humans matched by the patterns of extinction. And those figures of extinction are really very vague. I mean, I'm sure there are many more extinctions than that, simply because there'll be many species that have gone extinct, which we've never actually identified. But clearly, in Africa, the fact that the population growth is greatest in Africa is bad news for our relatives, the great apes, which are, of course, African primates, as indeed, of course, we are ourselves. There's this alarming truth. There are now more human babies born each day, 350,000, than there are individuals left of all the great apes combined, including gorillas, chimps, bonobos, and orangutans. Now, that's quite a startling statistic. And what I hope to be able to persuade you in this talk, successfully or not, I don't know, is that that's completely new, because for most of our history, genetics tells us, we were the endangered species. We were the species that had a very low birth rate, and the chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans had large and flourishing populations. We only just managed to survive. Things have changed, but I think we're very lucky, all of us, to be here because of the danger of extinction that we once faced. And that's why I suggest that if we are not an endangered species, we certainly were. Okay. So that's the alarming statistic, and it's not good news for our friend the chimpanzee, because if we look at the patterns of numbers of chimpanzees in 1900, and these figures are very, very rough. There were about 1 million. People suggest there were about 1 million. Another estimate was 2 million. By 1960, it was still 1 million. By the 1980s, it was down to about 200,000. And now it's actually gone up a little tiny bit. It's gone about 175,000 in 2003. But since 2003, it's gone down a lot. And the reason we know that is that somebody has spent a lot of time looking at the patterns of change in chimpanzee and great ape habitat. Okay. These are the declines in the types of habitat which are suitable for great apes. I won't bother you by species, but these are various species: chimps, bonobos, gorillas, and the like. If it's green, things are okay. If it's red, things are bad. And the red, it comes universally from human penetration of the rainforest, destroying trees, burning great areas of rainforest and the like, and it comes largely indeed, that in turn comes largely indeed from human population growth. And that's the figure from 1980 to 2000, but if you project what's going to happen to the future, as you're trying to do, to 2030, effectively there's going to be no habitat suitable for great apes at all. So it's quite likely that they will be, if not extinct, then very, very much on the edge of extinction. So again, the equation has greatly changed. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that we can use principles that come from evolution and principles that come from genetics to try and infer what happened not to our own species in the past, and indeed to do the same thing to what happened to these species in the past as well. Now, everybody knows about the voyage of the Beagle, and Charles Darwin's 5 years was on that ship. Of that 5 years, he spent just 5 weeks in the Galapagos Islands. Actually, on the islands, he only spent about two weeks altogether. But he immediately noticed on the Galapagos that populations that lived on islands were different from those that lived on the mainland. In fact, that was one of the main parts of his argument, that if you looked at Galapagos plants and animals, they were similar to, but not the same as, the plants and animals on South America. And that really was the first thing that gave him the idea of change. Before that, the idea had been fixity, that things could not change. And he began to wonder why this was. And in the 1830s, he didn't have an idea. He didn't know. He didn't develop his theory until considerably later. But since then, we've learned an enormous amount about the biology of islands. And what we found is that as an absolute universal, the amount of inherited diversity on island populations is far less than on the mainland. Okay? And that's true from things from fruit flies to lobelia plants to everything else. It's also, as we'll see in a moment, it's also true of ourselves, and it has quite an interesting implication for our own history, not just on islands, but on the mainland as well. And generally, there's much more genetic variation in big populations than in small populations. And if you didn't know you were on an island, let's say, and it's rather a strange image to have, and you simply had a DNA sequencing machine, you could tell that you were on a small island because there would be less variation in the fruit flies there than there were if you had done the experiment on the mainland. So you can use this observation to try and think backwards about what the patterns of movement and bottlenecks and that kind of stuff might have been for humans and their relatives. And the reason that there are smaller numbers of creatures on islands is simply really a matter of accident, statistical sampling and accident. If it's called the bottleneck effect, and I'm sure you've heard of it, if you have a bottle full of yellow and blue, equal numbers of yellow and blue beads, and you pour 10 of them into a cup, it's possible you'll get 5 blue and 5 yellow, but it's quite likely you'll get 6 and 4, or 4 and 6, or even 8 and 2, or 2 and 8. Every time you take a small sample, it's just like spinning a penny. If you only spin a penny 10 times, you wouldn't expect every time to get 5 heads and 5 tails. If you spin a penny 100 times, you expect pretty much to get 50 heads, more or less, and 50 tails, okay? So it's random sampling. It's stochastic effects, we call them in statistics. Now, in genetics, it's known as genetic drift. The tendency for frequencies of inherited variance to change when they go through small population bottlenecks, okay? And what we can do is a silly experiment I used to do with tiddlywinks with students and plastic bags. It wasn't a very expensive experiment. Unfortunately, the students over the years have stolen all the tiddlywinks, damn them. What we used to do, and it's a bit infantile, but actually it tells you what's going on. You take 50 black and 50 white tiddlywinks, you put them in a plastic bag, and I shake them all up, and I say, now they're mating. And the students snigger. And then I say, take them out in pairs, because tiddlywinks like ourselves are diploid. They've got 2 copies of every chromosome. Count how many black whites, and white whites there are, and there might be 6, and hence how many black and white variants there are. There might be 60 blacks and 40 whites when you've taken, it might be 6 blacks and 4 whites when you've taken 5 pairs out. So you put 60 blacks and 40 whites back in, and you just repeat the experiment. And if you do it, you get, because of this repeated sampling in this plastic bag or island, which is what it is, what you see is some remarkably fast changes in the inherited nature of that population, okay? And it's not the case that black is better than white or white is better than black. This is simple statistics. This is simply being isolated. And you'll see some populations begin to get more common in black, some people get more common in white. And once you hit the edge, all black or all white, that's it. You can't go anywhere. You remain, you're completely invariant. Now that effect depends on the size of the sample you take. If you take a small sample, it happens very quickly. If you take an enormous sample of 2,000 every generation at the bottom, it happens very slowly. It happens all the time, but for a big population, it doesn't happen very much. So that's what genetic drift does in plastic bags, as I say, in kind of islands. But we can actually see the same thing going on, not in plastic bags, but in human populations. And the advantage of humans have really become the new fruit flies with modern genetics. When I was a student, some years ago, I have to tell you, human genetics was almost a closed book. We knew a little bit. We knew a little bit about blood groups, and we knew a certain amount about rare diseases. It was a closed book really for 2 reasons. First of all, we didn't know anything. Not that usually inhibits geneticists from being totally confident in what they're saying, but because it had a very, very dark history, which I don't want to remind you of, but this was in the early 60s, and that was only 17 years or so after the closure of the extermination camps, which were strongly associated with genetical ideas. But things have changed. So we all worked on fruit flies, or in my case, on snails. But things have changed. As I say, if you want to do genetics now, you do it on humans. Part of the reason is that we can sequence human DNA at an extraordinary rate and very, very cheaply now for about $1,000 a person compared to $100 million a person, which is what it cost 16 years ago. But also, and perhaps more important, because in many cases we don't just have the history written in the genes, we have the history written in the books. And so we can look at the books, the history books, the fossils, and languages and that kind of stuff, and see how they fit with the records of biology. And often they fit remarkably well. There's a wonderful book by a gentleman who died just a couple of weeks ago. I'm reading his autobiography now, which actually is rather surprisingly badly written. He must have done it in a great rush. But this is Oliver Sacks, of course. He's the guy who wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which if you haven't read, you must read. It's a classic of modern English literature. He's a psychiatrist and a polymath, and he became very interested in this island. He went there, and he wrote a little book called The Island of the Colorblind. And what's interesting about this island, it's in the middle of the Pacific, a long way from everywhere. And we know from legends that in the 18th century, and there was an enormous hurricane and tidal wave, waves, which washed away nearly all the island's population, leaving only about a dozen people behind. Okay, so there was a bottleneck, a genuine bottleneck. And if you go there now, it turns out that actually it has the world's highest incidence of a very rare genetic disease called achromatopsia. And achromatopsia is basically night blindness. These people cannot see. So it's basically bright light blindness. These people can not see in daylight because their pupils don't respond properly, they're dazzled. They can't see in the dark, so they can only function in the brief twilight in the morning and in the evening. It's a good book because there are lots of, something like a fifth of the population suffer from this. It's quite a big population now, it's grown. And it's an interesting book because it describes how they fit into society and how society has changed its mores and its meal times in order to accommodate them. Okay, but we don't know anything about the details of what happened there. We don't know who was the person who must have been carrying the gene and survived, and we don't know how many people were there. However, we have another case which is rather closer to home, where we do know those things. And I'm very glad to talk about this particular case because it allows me to put in the compulsory advertising break, which every academic now has to put into every lecture at 15 and 30 minutes past the hour in order to ensure that the students are satisfied. So they fill in the forms and tick it all. Mine always say too many jokes when they fill in their form. But the advertisement is that it actually has to do with my latest book, which is called No Need for Geniuses, and is about the French Revolution, science in the French Revolution. Well, the French Revolution, like most revolutions, ended in tears. As Marx said of a later French Revolution, 1848, history always repeats itself first as tragedy and then as farce. The first French Revolution was tragedy. The 1848 Revolution, which led to the end of the monarchy, was much more of a farce. But the interesting thing, of course, that happened after the French Revolution was we got an emperor, the Emperor Napoleon. And the Emperor Napoleon, who was a remarkable figure and was a very good mathematician in his own right. There is a Napoleon theorem, believe it or not, it genuinely is. He caused all kinds of mayhem, tried to set up a united Europe a little bit too early, and led to deep splits in British political parties, and was captured and sent off to exile. And he was sent off to exile on the island of St. Helena, where he died within 5 years, allegedly, according to the French, from arsenic poisoning, because his hair after his death was found to be full of arsenic. The British did it, the French say. In fact, that's the way that people used to preserve the relics of great men, was put it in arsenic, so it wasn't our fault, really. But he died. But before he died, the British were concerned that he might do what he'd done once before, which is to escape from the island, although it's in the absolute middle of the Atlantic. His previous island was famously Elba in the Mediterranean, and able was I ere I saw Elba. Not a bad palindrome for somebody whose first language isn't English. Able was I ere I saw Elba. He escaped from there, so we put him somewhere where there was no way he could escape. It's 1,000 miles from land. However, he was known to be a good swimmer. So a garrison was then put, a British garrison was then put on the island of Tristan da Cunha, which is about another 1,000 miles to the south. So if he was swimming south, he couldn't get aboard. He couldn't get aboard there. There's Tristan da Cunha. There's where it is. Okay, a long way from anywhere, right down in the South Atlantic. And before 1816, which is when Napoleon was sent into exile, it was uninhabited. And in 1816, a British garrison was put on as part of a guard against Napoleon or any attempt to rescue Napoleon. 1817, Napoleon died, and the garrison was withdrawn. But a Scottish corporal, whose name was William Glass, and his wife, whose name was Sarah Williams, stayed to set up to do some farming, and their daughter, they stayed. And over the next 50 years, about 20 more people arrived. There was a shipwreck, and several of the sailors stayed. They put small ads in the South African press saying wives wanted for remote island, and they got wives, and they came. And we know all about these people. We know a great deal about their population history. And what happened was there were a number of booms and busts in that period. It started off by 1821, there were about 15 people there, and then it grew. I mean, it's quite a fertile island. People came, they set up farms. Then in the 1850s, a very depressed pastor, a preacher, came, and he told them, oh no, this is awful this year, there's no proper religion here, there's no proper church here, you'll have to leave. So lots of people left, and there was a population crash. Then it grew again. Then the men who did a lot of fishing had a boat called the West Riding, which was sunk at sea. A lot of men left, their wives left, and the thing bounced around. And they carried on with those kinds of numbers, 60 or 80 people, until 1961, when they were forced to move because there was a volcanic eruption. And the population, which was then about 200 people, all moved to Southampton. Don't ask me why. Okay, but they did. All right. And it turned out that their odd population history has led to the world's highest frequency of a particular inherited disease, another eye disease as it happens, which is called retinoblastoma. And retinoblastoma is a nasty disease. It's now controllable. It wasn't in 1970. It was always lethal. It's a cancer of the eye, and it's a cancer of the eye that fills the eye. The eye has to be taken out, sometimes fills both eyes, but it almost always spreads. Now it's much more controllable. In fact, rather in brackets, it's one of the very few in which gene therapy looks as if it might indeed do something, which generally it hasn't lived up to its promise. And it turns out we can trace the history of that to one of the founder individuals, who was Sarah Williams, who was the wife, the Welsh wife as it happens, of the Scots corporal William Glass, who first came to the island. So in this case, we know exactly who brought the gene, and just by random chance, the tiddlywink effect, that gene has gone up and down and ended up going up, and it's relatively common. Okay, so that too is a statement that a small population bottleneck long ago can have an effect on the future. And the extent of the effect depends on the size of the population. If 1,000 people had come to Tristan da Cunha, there would have been no effect. They might all have starved, of course, because they wouldn't have lived on it, but there would have been no effect because the chances of any random change of that kind would be very small. And it seems highly unlikely that any large population could show this drift, this sampling drift, as it's known. But that's not true, because when you're trying to work out what we call the effective size of the human population or any other population, you need to know not just how many people are living in it today. As in Tristan, there were 270 in 1960. You need to know how many people lived in it in the past. Now, in Tristan, we can do that because we've got the census records. And in human populations, in other human populations, we can often do that too. Okay, we need a special kind of average. Okay, now it's not the arithmetic average. It's called the harmonic mean. And imagine a population in which numbers. It's not very realistic, but let's imagine the numbers of a particular population fluctuate over 5 generations from 1,000 to 1,000 to 1,000 to 10. There's a volcanic eruption. Then through lusty efforts, it rises to 1,000 in the next generation again, okay? Well, what's the arithmetic mean, just the average, is the size of the population is 802. But you miss a lot by just saying that, because clearly what's important to the genetic future of the population is not the times when it was 1,000, but the times when it was 10, all right? So what you use is a special kind of statistic, which is called the harmonic mean. Now, this is actually much easier than it looks. I keep telling my students. It consists of k, the number of generations, and in our little example we've made it 5, over 1 over the number in the first generation, plus 1 over the number in the second generation, plus 1 over the number in the third generation, all the way, in our case, to 1 over the number in the fifth generation. But the thing will work for any number of generations. And that's the population I imagined, 1,000, 1,000, 1,010, 1,000. The arithmetic mean is 82, but the harmonic mean is 48. So the joy of the harmonic mean is that it's telling you that at some time in the past this population went through a bottleneck, and however large it may have become today, the thing which is going to influence its survivors, its descendants, is that bottleneck. And we can now turn the logic on its head in genetics, and we can look at populations and how much variation there is, and ask how much of a bottleneck must there have been to lead to the differences, let's say, between this population and a population 100 miles away. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Well, there's one population that illustrates that very clearly. Here are the Amish. Now, the Amish are one of many, what used to be many, religious isolates in North America. There are plenty of physical islands around, but I think the mental islands are even more isolated and unattainable. In Britain there are strong social and religious barriers against marriages between followers of Islam and followers of Christianity, say. And that's really that's not just a narrow sea, that's an enormous ocean which people refuse to cross. And that's also true very much in the United States. It's what I like William Blake's phrase, it's mind-forged manacles. The manacles, the barriers, the prison is only in the mind, but it's very, very powerful, okay? And this is one well-known religious isolate in the United States, and it's a very stringent one. They're called the Amish, and they fled Switzerland, where they lived, to escape the religious wars of the late 16th and late 17th and early 18th century. They were what's called Anabaptists. And Anabaptists, I think, had a rather sensible philosophy, which was it didn't make any sense to baptize a baby into Christ, because the baby didn't know what was going on. If you were going to accept Christ by being baptized, you had to do it when you were 21, when you had the ability to think whether you would actually wanted to do this or not. And that seems fairly logical, but of course to the Catholic Church that was actually anathema. Many of them were killed. One standard way to kill them, if somebody had been baptized as an adult, was to give him a third baptism by tying a rock around his leg and throwing him into the lake. Okay, so you drown them. And understandably, large numbers of people left, all right? And in the early 18th century, a group of them, not a very big group, about 100 or so, immigrated to Pennsylvania, and where they formed a closed community, and having been discriminated against, then to get their own back, discriminated against everybody else, because they wouldn't talk to them, okay? Well, they're an interesting lot. They're still there. I've seen them. Many Americans have seen them. They're quite abundant in Eastern America, and they have remarkable desire to remain unchanged. They wear the costume of the 18th century. Okay, as you can see, if they're strict believers, as many of them are, they refuse to use motor cars. They use horses and carts instead. If they're a bit more, bit like, what's it called, radio magic, fading in and out in the Cotswolds, if their beliefs aren't quite as strong, they drive cars, and they're looked down on by the strict neighbours, but they paint the bumpers black, because it's not flashy, you see. They're called black bumper Amish, all right? They have a remarkable, rather clever philosophy about teenagers, which is they say to teenagers, all right, we can send, particularly to boys, of course, we're going to send you into the wider community. It's called the Rumspringer It means bouncing about. Their language is Pennsylvania Dutch. They speak Dutch to each other, or Deutsch really, rather than Dutch. Pennsylvania Dutch it's called. You can go into Philadelphia, wherever you like. You can have a wonderful time. And after a year, you can decide whether to stay in the outside world or come back. And 80% of them come back. Okay. Now, like lots and lots of such isolates, they're very, very fecund. Here are the Pennsylvania Amish in the modern day, and here are the numbers of Amish colonies there were before 1850. Some of which actually had gone extinct. The black dots. So there were only about half a dozen Amish colonies. By 1990, the number of colonies had rocketed up, as you can see, and largely because there's an average of 6 children to each family, and at the present rate, the numbers of Amish will be the same as at the moment. There are now 220,000 of them. If that continues until the end of the century, there'll be as many Amish as there are Americans at the moment. I think that's unlikely, but it sort of tells you that something, the power of fecundity. But if we look at the genetics of the Amish, it turns out that indeed they have large numbers of otherwise rare genetic conditions. Because they went through a bottleneck, just by chance, some of the people who came carried single copies of these diseases, as several people in this room carry single copies of the condition for cystic fibrosis, and they don't know anything about it. You need 2 copies for it to come together and be harmful. And here are just some of them. A kind of muscular dystrophy, Ellis von Creveld, I'll show you in a moment, a dwarfism, polydactylism, various things, which are generally speaking very rare, but are relatively common in this population. And in some cases, they're found nowhere else in the world. Here's one of them, Ellis von Creveld, and it's a skeletal problem. You can see various aspects of the bones and the like are badly damaged, and there's this dwarfism, cartilage hair hypoplasia, which is, again, unique to the Amish. And that comes because they went through a bottleneck. And that kind of thing is true of many religious isolates. Everybody knows, for example, that Ashkenazi Jews tend to have relatively high frequency of the nervous degenerative disease known as Tay-Sachs disease, and that's quite common among the North London Orthodox community. And that turns from the fact, which is well attested from genetics, that half of all the millions of Ashkenazi Jews in the world today descend from one of 4 women who were among the tiny group of Ashkenazim who moved from Italy, which is what they did in about the 11th century, into the Rhine Valley and into Germany, and grew enormously in numbers. So any population that does that is liable, through the penny spinning and the bottleneck effect, to generate its own pattern of genetic variation, some of which you identify as being harmful genetic variation. Now, so we need to take into account the size of the bottleneck. And the size of the bottleneck is actually more subtle than you think, because the bottleneck refers to the reproducing population. If somebody has no children, you don't count them as members of the bottleneck because they didn't reproduce. And if you look in many societies today, and certainly in previous days, it turns out that quite a lot of people had no children, or put it another way, that quite a lot of men had no children. And Darwin was the first to point out that actually there's more variation in male mating success in many species than in female, because the number of children a female, a woman, for example, might have, is limited by the mere facts of biology. She has to become pregnant, she has to look after the infant, she has to feed the infant, and so on. Whereas a male can have a lifelong Rumspringer and leap out and nominally fertilize large numbers of females. It is, of course, the case that every time a man has sex, he makes enough sperm to fertilize every woman in Europe, which, thank God, nobody actually does. All right, so even counting Boris Johnson into the equation. So there is potentially much more variation in male mating success than in female. And that means, of course, that some males will not succeed in reproducing at all. The amount of variation is reflected by what we call sexual dimorphism among primates. If the males and females are very different, as in gorillas, then only a very few males succeed in mating. In chimps, the differences are smaller, so the inequality is smaller again. And in humans, it's fairly fairly small. Here we have two individually tall people, but it's clear that the male is taller than the female and more muscular, and that suggests there may have been a pattern of sexual selection and difference in mating patterns in the past. But there are cases where the effect is really quite striking. You can see that in modern developed societies, there isn't really very much difference in the variation in mating success in men and women. In Finland, actually, women have more variation in mating than men do, which says something about Finnish society. In Norway, which is a very equitable kind of place, it's about equal. In the US, some men are fairly successful and others aren't. But when you go to people in Africa, like the Dogon, who live in Mali, or the Ache, who live in Paraguay, these are not exactly hunter-gatherers, but they're living an early way of life. Then there's a big difference in the variation of men and women in mating success, which means that lots of men don't get any mates at all. So although they're hanging around looking fierce and banging drums, they're not taking part in the bottleneck. So we have to discount them. Okay. Now that does happen still in recent times. Here's a picture of a family on holiday in Switzerland. It's obviously in the 1960s, as I think you can see. The gentleman with a ring around his face is actually Osama bin Laden. Changed a bit with the years. And everybody else in that picture is his brother, his sister, his half-brother, or his half-sister. And Osama bin Laden's father, Mohammed bin Laden, had 22 wives and 53 children. And in the year of Osama's own birth, he had 6 more children. And Osama himself had, last time they were counted, 5 wives and 22 children. That means that in that society there were plenty of men who had no success at all. And we can work out that pattern in historical terms by looking at the great signifier of maleness, which is the Y chromosome, which, as I've said to this gathering before, is very much like a surname. It's a series of DNA variants that sit together in one block. So you can identify particular families and groups of Y chromosomes simply by looking at the DNA variation in them. That's called a haplotype. Now, generally speaking, if I was to grind up all the men in this room, we would find quite a variety of haplotypes. And that's true in many parts of the world, but not all. There's one part of the world where, quite remarkably, one Y chromosome is very, very common. And in fact, in this part of the world, probably 200 or 300 million men, seeing it stretches way into China, maybe even more, 200 or 300 million men have the identical Y chromosome, which means, by definition, that they descend from the same historical individual. And here he is. Genghis Khan. It's almost certainly Genghis Khan because the boundaries of that Y chromosome overlap with the boundaries of his empire, the Mongolian Empire. So Genghis and his sons, like Kublai Khan and grandsons, they all had the same Y chromosome. They were all highly promiscuous, and they had enormous sexual success, which means, if you wanted to know how many men there were, how many fathers there were in that population, there might be very few, but thousands and thousands of mothers. So you have to take that into account. So that's what we do when we're working out the patterns of bottlenecks. So let's get to the let's cut to the chase here. Everybody knows that we are all Africans. Some of us are more Africans than others, but we escaped from Africa. Really quite recently. Something like there are arguments about when, but around 50,000 years ago, they escaped from Africa, and we stayed around in the Middle East for a while, and then into Europe about 40,000 years ago, and into China actually rather earlier than that, and then into the Americas only about 20,000 years ago, and into New Zealand only 1,000 years ago. Okay, that's in the historical record. And what we can do is make a map of the way we did it. And obviously we didn't swim the Indian Ocean and the Pacific to get to New Zealand. We walked there, okay? We may have to take the last bit by sea, but generally we walked there. And what people have done is to look at human populations in relation to their distance from an arbitrary spot, which is Addis Ababa in the north of in northeast Africa, which is just an arbitrary spot, and work out how far you would have to walk in order to get, say, to southern India or to the southern tip of South America. And then we look at the DNA variation and we ask, what are the patterns of DNA variation in those populations? Well, the effect is really quite striking. In fact, it isn't really biology, it's mathematics. This is the amount of variation in the DNA in relation to the distance from Addis Ababa shown. And you see an absolutely striking similarity, a striking tendency for the amount of variation to decrease as people moved further and further away, okay? And in fact, by the time you get to places like the southern tip of South America and Oceania, which are things like Tahiti, there is only about half, a little bit more than half as much as the variation that you get in parts of Africa itself. And that tells us that there have been lots and lots of bottlenecks on the way out, okay? We haven't moved in a great swarm out of Africa. Small groups have moved, they've broken up, another small group has moved on, and so on and so on. Every time that's happened, the process I've been talking about, random change, has actually been taking place. And we can work out the size of that bottleneck from the reduction in variation from one step to the next. I have to tell you with not much bitterness anyway, who was the first person ever to do that? That was me, damn it, in about 1978 with an Iranian friend of mine, a physicist called Shaheen Rouhani, and just when the very first data on DNA variation within an African group and a European group came out, Shaheen said to me, we could work out how big the bottleneck was. So we worked it out in a rather simplistic way. And the bottleneck was 12 people for one generation, or 42 people for 4 generations, I think it was, I can't remember. It was very small. And we published it in a little-known journal known as Nature, the most important scientific journal in the world. And nobody's ever referred to it since, damn them. And this has become an industry doing this in a much more sophisticated way than we did it. But, you know, I do make a point of telling this to every audience I speak to. But this kind of thing, what this kind of thing does is allow you to work out how big the bottlenecks were on each of those steps. I trust you see the logic. It's the logic of finding out you're on an island by finding how much reduced the variation is compared to the mainland. And if it's very reduced, you can work out that it must have been through a very small bottleneck. And here is the pattern. I don't know if you can see it here, and I'm going to explain this in more detail in a minute. These are the bottleneck sizes on each step of that journey from Africa across the world. For women, and shown in red, numbers and triangles, and for men, you can see, just glancing at it, that the numbers of women who moved were much greater than the numbers of men. And that turns on this inequality in mating success between males and females. But I'll look at the figures in some... Oh, bugger. I'll look at the figures in some more detail. So out of Africa... in the original bottleneck, which got out of Africa, that is the bottleneck which I described as being 10 when we did the harmonic mean calculation, okay. Out of Africa, something like 15 men and 26 women moved from Africa and founded the rest of the world's population, which isn't very many, I think you'll agree. Into Europe, 18 men and 118 women, okay? So there was even more inequality in sexual success between men and women in the emerging populations that moved into Europe. Into India, my God, 74 men and 1,663 women. So there was immense inequality. Just a few powerful men monopolized all the women, and then so on into the Americas, 21 men and 90 women. Now what you can do is to complete cranking that boring equation, the harmonic mean equation, we're just working out what the bottleneck itself might be by adding today's populations to them, how big they got over time, and the effective population size of Europe is only 3,800 men and 8,000 women. Even today, even given the millions of people who live here, the effective population size of the Americas is only 700 men and 1,800 women. So in fact, we've all living a history which turns on the random accidents of the past. And indeed, for much of that past, we were an endangered species. And we can see that, actually, in a very strange piece of work that's just come out. You can now look at Neanderthal DNA. And if you look at Neanderthal DNA, it turns out that the Neanderthals were very, very, very much, in their last days, very much lacking in genetic variation. And these are called runs of homozygosity, which I won't bother you with. But what this consists of, if you look at the amount of variation in a Frenchman, had to be a bloody Frenchman, of course. The highest, the most evolved population of any on Earth. Okay, there's French variation. There's lots of it. Here are 2 Neanderthals. There's one from the Altai, and you can see there's vast segments of chromosome where there's no variation at all. And that tells us that this creature was very, very rare. before they just finally disappeared, there were almost none of them left. So they were really going through a bottleneck, which turned out to be terminal, because they were then beaten out by modern humans. And some people say that we got out of Africa ourselves, modern humans, several times, and then went extinct before the population succeeded in exploding into the world. But be that as it may, we were an endangered species. Now let's try and put that into the primate context. We can look at primates. What we can find, and what we find is really rather startling, I suppose, is that if you look at the overall variation, the sequence divergence, as I would call it, the amount of variation in DNA in humans, in chimps, and in gorillas, and the 5 central groups of various gangs of chimpanzees, there's a striking difference. Humans, Homo sapiens, the species to which many of us claim to belong, is much less variable at the DNA level than any other large primate. Okay? So we must have been rare for a long time when the other primates were abundant and generating lots of diversity. And we can show that in a different way. We can draw a family tree of modern humans, and in the context of other primates, this is a DNA-based tree, you can see the modern humans there, the red line. The red lines are very short. The lines which join the chimpanzees are much longer, and the length of each line is a different individual person or chimp or gorilla, and the longer the line, the more different it is from the lines that are around it. Okay, and you can see chimpanzees are very variable. Orangutans, of which we only have 3 individuals in this graph, are also very different from each other. But humans are remarkably homogeneous. We are the primate that did not evolve at the DNA level, particularly. Perhaps indeed because we evolved in our minds, but that's another story. The effect is really quite striking. You could draw a map of the various races of chimpanzees in East Africa, which have now been extensively worked on. And the difference between the purple race there, which is troglodytes, and the blue race, which almost overlap, Schweinfurthii, if you take 2 populations 30 miles apart, each of the different subspecies, as they're called, they're much more different genetically than the average difference between the population of France and the population of Papua New Guinea. We are the most boring primate that has ever lived, okay? There's no question of it. So they were flourishing when we were rare. And if you, the amount of overall variation in the DNA suggests that over the long term, that's over the evolution of the group Homo over several million years, the population size didn't go much above 10 to 15,000 people, whereas the great apes, there might have been millions of them. Okay, so we were a rare species. So that's really is my take-home lesson, that we might think ourselves successful and massively abundant, but in fact, we are damn lucky to get to here at all. And we could have gone extinct at any time in that period. The creatures that face that danger now, of course, are not ourselves, but our relatives. This is an arcane bit of genetics, and I can't say I fully understand it, but I'll do my best. People do some very, very complicated number crunching on the genetics of humans and chimps and other primates to try and work out how many there had been at different times in the past. And here's the time scale, and it's logarithmic, 10 to the minus 2, 3, and so on, time. And here's today. And what we find is that if we look at chimpanzees, the height of each peak is the numbers of chimpanzees which must have lived at that time. And I can't understand the calculus myself, so don't ask me any questions about it. But people seem to believe it. If other people believe it, it's bound to be true. And you can see there was, for some reason we don't fully understand, about 3 million years ago, a big drop in the chimpanzee populations in Africa. And then there's a drop, and then, but until quite recently, and historic times, 1,000 years ago or so ago, there were quite a lot of them. Okay. Now, if we do the same for humans, we had the same drop there, but here we have, for example, a human population, which are the Yoruba, who are a Nigerian group, they historically never went through a big population bottleneck, because they were abundant in Nigeria, but European populations like the French did. So you can see that we really were, when we put ourselves in the context of several thousand years, nearly did go bust at this moment, but we didn't. We're still here. Where will you see chimpanzees in 50 years from now? In a zoo. That's the only place you'll see them, more than likely. I hope it's a nicer zoo than this, but it's a rather telling statement about the future of what is now an endangered species. And I slightly wonder whether we can't summarize our own future in a simple image, which is this one, which will make us all endangered, but in a very different way. So I'll stop there. Thank you.